Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And once again, welcome to Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary, our Charlotte campus. We hope everybody has enjoyed the pig picking, which is our traditional way of kicking off the academic year here at the Charlotte campus. And now we are ready to move on to the first of our Clipowicz integrative events for 2018 and 19. These events are named in honor of our beloved former professor, Dr. Steve Clipowicz, who was for 20 years a professor here at the Charlotte campus, had a great passion for our students and a great ministry to our students. And so at various different points during the year, we have events which seek to integrate what we're learning in the classroom and academic preparation for ministry with practical expressions of Christian faith and practical ministry preparation as well. The first of our Clipowicz integrative events each year, the one that we are about to have this afternoon, is sponsored by the Center for the Development of Redemptive Leadership. Dr. Rod Cooper in the back here is the director of that center. And this afternoon, for our leadership conference, we are very pleased to have Dr. Jimmy Long with us. Dr. Long is a longtime member of InterVarsity staff in the Carolinas and the regional director for InterVarsity in the Carolinas. And as a result of his work in that position over many decades, he has seen the new emerging generations of young people come through year after year as the students have come through the University of North Carolina and other universities in the Carolinas and InterVarsity's ministry. And as a result, he has gained a wealth of experience in leadership, in working in leadership with people from what he calls and what we call emerging generations. And we have had the great privilege for the last couple of years now to have Dr. Long with us as an adjunct professor in his retirement. So in his retirement from InterVarsity, he is spending a lot of time with us teaching leadership for us. We are delighted to have him teaching those leadership classes. Our students have responded to him very enthusiastically. And we are also delighted to have him here with us this afternoon to speak to us about leadership. Dr. Long, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to have you with us.
It is a great honor for me to be here. I'm a product of Gordon-Conwell Seminary. I grew up in the Carolinas, went to school at Florida State, and then after been married a couple of months, my wife and I packed up our car and moved to South Hamilton. Never seen the seminary before. This was 1972 and spent 3 years there. Planning to go into the Presbyterian pastorate and then decided to go on the InterVarsity staff for 4 years before I did that. And then 2 years ago, I retired after 41 years on InterVarsity staff. In the meantime, I ended up, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I learned through this, getting a doctorate of ministry degree from Gordon-Conwell in the mid-90s, which I recommend for some of you, not right after you graduate from your MDiv or other master's programs, but maybe 10 or 15 years later. And then it's been a joy for me to be involved in the initial parts of this campus before we even had this building, and being on the board of advisors and seeing the initial plans for this campus by the architect, and then see the fruition and seeing all of you here. I actually had the privilege, I think it was the first official chapel service here to speak. I was doing a similar seminar that day. And so, and excited to be back teaching classes, especially the Foundations of Leadership class, and some of you who are former students in that class. I'm glad you're here, and I've already met a couple students who will be in the fall class, and good to meet you. Any others who are here today in the fall class, I'd love to meet you during the break. And so what I'd like to have you do is I'd like for you to go on a journey with me. It's a journey that I actually started almost 30 years ago. I'd been involved on staff with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at UNC Chapel Hill, helped it grow from about 200 to about 750 students in about a 7-year period of time. Then became regional director, and over 25, 30 years as regional director, helped work in the Carolinas, Virginia, grow to about 4,000 students and about 70 staff. Parallel to that, very much involved in our church, the Chapel Hill Bible Church. It was about 200 when we moved there, and now it's a little over 1,000, and over a 20-year period of time was probably chair of the Board of Elders 5 or 6 times, so actually involved in the local church. But it was actually after I'd been involved in ministry within our church at UNC Chapel Hill, and it was going well, that I began to have something in the back of my mind saying something's different than 15 years ago, from the mid-'70s to as we approached 1990. I wasn't exactly sure what that was. I didn't see a lot of other people asking the same questions. I began, after I started exploring, saw there were other people asking the same questions. And to me, the beginning point for me was when I was speaking to an university meeting at UNC Chapel Hill in early December. I have no idea what I spoke on. And I'm not really good in short, talk before meetings. Just as an introvert, as I call myself a job extrovert, I just asked a simple question to a few people. And one was to a young woman named Joan. I said, Joan, are you going home for Christmas? Right before the meeting started. Didn't think anything about it, except she burst out into tears. And then the meeting had to start. And I said to her something, I didn't say anything to her. I got here, and I don't remember what I spoke on, but I just saw her sitting against the wall, crying, tears, during that whole time. I went up to her and said, Joan, I am so sorry. I did not mean to, ask a question that I thought would be really hard. And she said, that's okay. But my parents got divorced and they each have been remarried twice. I don't know where my home is. I don't know where my home is. And I began to realize there are a lot of Joans out there, and even more now. And the two things about it is that one, it was important to her. She wanted to belong, which again in the 60s and 70s, in the modern time, there's a lot of individualism. It's me, myself, and I. When I was at Florida State University, my favorite group was a group that some of you probably don't even know, Simon and Garfunkel. And Art Garfunkel had a song called I Am a Rock, I Am an Island. And I just played that over and over again because that was my viewpoint. I don't want to open up to anybody. I want to be myself. I began to see, thankfully, that other people were starting to want to belong. And then saw within Joan is that she didn't have a place to belong. And that started me on a journey that I'm still on today after 30 years. Initially looking at generations and what the generations are, and began to think through there's something larger than that going on. And began to realize that, again, it's important when the ministry is going well is to start asking the hard questions, what's next? It's not when you're in a crisis, when you're just trying to keep your head above water. And began to ask 3 questions to consider that I think are appropriate for any time that there is change, and especially cultural change. One is, how is culture changing? How is culture changing? I want you just to think through the last 30, 40 years. For some of you, that means 25 years because you don't know what 40 years was like or 30 years. But sometime in your lifetime in the last 30 years or so, what have you seen in some cultural change? Just yell it out. Something's changed?
Clothing.
What?
Clothing.
Clothing. Clothing, yes. I thought you were saying cloning, Jonathan. But that's true. Okay, what else? Technology, yes. Kitchen utensils, yes. Health and wellness. Education, yes. Marriage, yes. Yes. Definition of family, yes. Mass shootings, yes. I've gone through the gamut in terms of recording devices, from a record player and vinyls that some people, what's that? To MP3 players, to cassettes, to CDs, to now, you develop your own live stream understanding of what music and how it's been involved. Can we get the... Okay. Second question is, how is God involved in this change? How is God involved in this change? One of the things I think happens is that we are as Christians especially, no different than the other parts of society, in that we're fearful of change. I just read a book dealing with the election. It was written by John Fee, F-E-A, who's a Christian historian, on the Trump election called Believe Me. And one of the things he brings about in that is that a lot of votes on both sides during the 2016 election was out of fear. Was out of fear. And so one of the things we've got to grapple with is, does God want us to live out of fear? And I'm convinced he doesn't. One of my favorite books of the Bible is the book of Habakkuk. And in the book of Habakkuk, there's two reasons I like it. One is God allows the prophet Habakkuk just to be honest with him. Just to kind of say, God, I don't understand what you're doing, or I think I do, and would you stop doing it? And so first, Habakkuk begins to talk about all the injustice in Israel, especially in Jerusalem. And he begins to question God. And God's response to Habakkuk initially was, you would not believe if told about what I'm going to do. And what he's going to do is bring the Babylonians, and they're going to wipe out Jerusalem, wipe out the temple. And we're going to see Habakkuk even has more questions. And he sits on his tower and says, I'm going to wait to see if God's going to respond to me and how I'm going to respond to God. And then God starts to respond and starts to help him remember his faithfulness from the past. And that if he's faithful in the past, he'll be faithful in the present and future. And Habakkuk starts to remember God's faithfulness. And at the end, instead of Habakkuk having a final response of negativism, it's a final response of worship. That is our God. Our God is a God who's involved. This isn't a dichotomy world of Satan in control and we as Christians trying to rescue people in this world. God is a God who's the creator of this world, sustainer of this world, and he desires for us to be involved. So the third question is, how does God want us to be involved? And that's where we're going to spend quite a bit of time today looking at how God wants us to be involved as we think about these cultural changes. And one of the things to realize is that in these critical moments, they happen over a long period of time. We'll talk a little bit in a minute, but there's a lot of talk about generations, boomers, Xers, millennials, Generation Z. And those can be helpful to think about. And that's really what I spent a whole year dealing with in the early 90s. And I was starting my doctorate of ministry program. I was dealing with the whole question, how do we reach, at that point they were called baby busters, Gen X. I'm glad they changed the name. And began to realize that one, it was very Western, very short-lived, and also had a philosophical problem. In that the problem is that the people, Howe and Strauss, who did a lot of sociology, did a lot of writing, they had learned from a man by the name of Arthur Schlesinger, who was a historian in the 40s and 50s and 60s, who had a cyclical view of history. So if you read about Howe and Strauss, and they were the initial people thinking about generational changes, they wrote a book called Generations that had 14 generations since the time of the American Revolution. And every 7 years, there was a cycle. It started all over again, the issues involved with it. And began to realize, one, if it was just Western, especially the United States, it wasn't cross-cultural. And secondly, it had a cyclical view of history. We as Christians can see that as the final answer. And so as I began to wrestle with some more, Peter Drucker, who is in the 80s and 90s, was very much involved in the change in terms of business, but a very committed Christian in the midst of that. Every few hundred years in Western history, there occurs a sharp transformation. Within a few short decades, society rearranges itself. 50 years later, there's a new world. And the people born then cannot even imagine the world in which their grandparents lived and into which their parents were born. We are currently living through just such a transition. One of the things I enjoy about being retired is I get to play with our grandkids. Also, I'm not in charge or anything, but I get to play with our grandkids. And just thinking of Asher and Karis, who are now 12 and 9, of thinking they didn't understand life of when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s. They can't even imagine it because they don't understand the transition from modern to postmodern, emerging, whatever you want to call it. They just know what's here. And they're dealing with it, not necessarily philosophically yet, but dealing with it with their friends and other things. And so it's something that changes. Stan Grins, who I got to know as I was working on some of this material in the Doctor of Ministry program, I partnered with Leighton Ford on a couple of endeavors. Leighton is on the Board of Trustees here at Gordon-Conwell, very much involved in helping start Gordon-Conwell Charlotte. And we did a consultation where we brought in a number of different people. And one of the people we brought in was a guy named Dieter Zander, who was at that point the pastor of the first Gen X church in California, who about 2 months later was hired by Willow Creek to head their Access program at Willow Creek. And the other person we brought in was Stan Grins, who was at that point a professor at Regent University, Regent in Vancouver. And in inviting them both to come, Dieter says, "Why are we talking about postmodernism?" And Stan says, "I know nothing about boomers or busters. Do you know something about postmodernism?" "Yes, I do know about that." And so in a 3-day consultation, I can remember here in Charlotte, I can remember very vividly their eyes linking. And they begin to realize we both have something to offer. And so when Dieter left that time, the only seminars he moved to Willow Creek, led seminars throughout the country and talked about ministry in a postmodern world where before he didn't even know what it was. And Stan Grins wrote a book called The Primer of Postmodernism as a result of that. And he said, I have something to offer people who are doing real ministry, who aren't just living in an ivory tower. And so I began to learn from people like that. Began to look at what are the different shifts in time since the time of Christ. A book that I ran across was written by a man by the name of David Bosch, who was a South African theologian this was in the early 90s, and wrote a book called Transforming Mission that I've taught a class here called Ministry Among Emerging Generations, and that's one of the books that we offer for that class. And he looks at the different major paradigm shifts at the time of Christ. And the first we see is the Hellenistic Roman. And in the way, and I don't have time to take a long time dealing with this, but we see the expansion of the church from a very marginalized group of people to being, as Dr. Hollinger taught today, organizing themselves, moving, as you see in the book of Acts, they started in Jerusalem, and by the end of the book of Acts, they were in Rome. And we see a couple of things happen. We see them influencing the Roman Empire, the Roman leadership, and it came from a very small little group of people on the fringe to now very much involved in society itself and joined forces with the Roman leadership, which has its good points and bad points. Then there was a transition to medieval time, from about AD 600 to AD 1500. And there's two parallel things I want to talk about. One was the barbarian invasion coming in. And so the Roman Empire and Western Europe was devastated and decimated. At the same time, church was very much tied into the public discourse and the public organizations and the leadership. And so we have we call Christendom. But at the same time, parallel to that, God's raised up the monastic movement, who weren't just bringing people in to kind of survive, but also dealing with education and moving out as some of the first missionaries within the church. So you see things happening, but God involved to bring about his purpose in the midst of that. And then we move to an enlightenment in modern times from AD 1500 to maybe 2000. And again, parallel things going on. We have a movement from a sense of God's transcendency of God to God is not involved at all. There's a dome. There is truth, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's a truth that we as humans can only understand. There is no God to bring about truth. And you saw the reason. You saw people moving away from Christianity. But at the same time, God was raising up the Reformation and Martin Luther, John Calvin, and others, the Anabaptists, to bring about again, to keep his mission going forth. And then we see the transition today from to a postmodern transition from AD 1968, which I would say is a kind of the point of no return, to we don't know when it will end. What are some things, some of you probably studying in history, some of you were alive at the time. What's one event? There are multiple events, but one thing that happened in 1968. Go ahead, yell it out if you know it.
Assassinations.
Okay, assassinations of who?
The
Yeah, so in the United States, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy within 2 months of each other. And then what else? The TED offense is very good. In the January of 1968, at that point in time, the American people thought we were winning the Vietnam War. And we were told that we were winning. We were going to win very soon. And then what happened was the Tet Offensive, where the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong almost overran all of South Vietnam. They didn't, but it began to see that in what happened a few months later called the My Lai Massacre, where a group of American Marines massacred a group of South Vietnamese who were defenseless, who were citizens. That the Americans began to not have faith that their government was perfect, that they knew everything. And so began to have the start of the student revolts. Came about in areas of civil rights and other areas too. Third thing, what else? The Russians didn't get off, from their own fiasco. We just had the 50th anniversary last week of the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Russian tanks, where Alexander Dubček in Czechoslovakia had set up a communist government, socialist government with a lot more freedom, and it was being heralded in other places. And what happened was that the Russian tanks came in August and wiped it out. And so you had people who were communists, diehard communists, began to realize the communist system isn't any better than the capitalist system of the United States. And so you had the two major superpowers having people no longer believing in them. And you had a young Parisian graduate student named Jacques Letard, who was a believer in progress. He ended up becoming very cynical, ended up being one of the leaders of the postmodern philosophical movement in the 1980s. So 1968, the point of no return, that happened to be my high school, senior year in high school. And so we just had our 50th anniversary reunion. And it's interesting, we would all be very traditionalists, in this nice, predominantly white high school in Columbia, South Carolina. But getting back, and I had very little contact with any of them for 50 years, but getting back and seeing that the woman who was the homecoming queen, Randy McClendon, and I can't remember her married name now, had become a major feminist. You'd never think she would be that. You would have Don Belt, who ended up working for National Geographic, going all over the world, dealing with areas about religion. Celeste Wesson, who ended up being a producer for NPR and I think still produces Marketplace in NPR in California. And then you have people who never changed. What they were like in the 60s, they're like the same. But it's interesting seeing a group of people who had no idea what was going on society-wise 50 years later looking back and seeing the impact it's had. So what's this transition from modern to emerging culture? One is a movement from individual to a community. There's a sense of, in modern times, there was a sense of it's me. It's my Art Garfunkel song, I'm a rock, I'm an island. It's the individual was what's important. But in emerging culture, we have people like Joan that I talked about earlier, who was looking for a place to belong, looking for a community. And I'm convinced, and you'll see me later, is that's one of the things actually God's bringing about, is that the church had bought into much of the church into enlightenment understanding that the individual, what's most important. Whereas you look at the Trinity, you look at other places in Scripture, look at even how we translate the word you. In Greek, we translate it individually, but the vast majority of times you should be translating you from the Greek to the English is plural. It means a community. And so one of the things we begin to see is this movement from individual to community, which I think is God-inspired. Now, we're going to see in a minute that it gets into the problems in society, how we deal with that. The second one is a movement from objective truth to subjective truth. And this is where we as Christians sometimes get caught up in something that's not helpful. Again, in modern times, objective truth wasn't God's truth, as it was in many years before. Objective truth is what humankind can understand through scientific proofs and things like that. And so it left God out. And so those of us who were involved in ministry in the 60s and 70s, the first thing we had to convince people is that objective truth is more than just what we see here. A number of years ago, somebody interviewed 3 umpires before the Chicago Cubs baseball game. And they asked, how do you call balls and strikes? And the first umpire said, I call them as they are. It's truth. I call them as they are. Second one says, I call them as I see them. Now, it might mean he just didn't have good glasses, a good viewpoint, but it also means that he gets to decide. I mean, it's relative. The third one says, they ain't nothing until I call them. All would say there's truth, but one is much more enlightened, one is much more postmodern. Even this week, I was listening to to show how these questions are still relevant. I was listening to Meet the Press, where the Meet the Press moderator was interviewing Rudy Giuliani and was asking about truth. And Giuliani said, well, truth isn't what you think it is. And the moderator says, wait a minute, did I hear you correct? That truth isn't what you think it is? Yes, truth is your perspective of it. And again, I'm not sure, although when I heard a third response to him later on, it still grappled with the whole question of objective truth versus subjective truth. Is that truth too often today is what we decide it to be, which we as Christians will have problems with, or should. The third transition is movement from word to image. And what I mean by that is that too often, especially in the Christian world, as we think about a church service, and we'll talk about communication in the second half, is we only deal with word, what we can think, what we can read, and we don't deal with image. And we think when we deal with image, it's also secondary. Let's put it off to the side. But if you look at Scripture, time and time again, God presents a picture, an image. And that image says so much more than a word can say. And so that, especially when people grapple with the truth, sometimes image is what's going to draw them initially. And so we need to realize that image in a postmodern world can be our friend sometimes. Fourth transition is a movement from a meta-narrative to a micro-narrative. And what I mean by that is that meta-narratives, or let me ask you, what's a meta-narrative? What? Go ahead, speak up. It's a big story. It's an overarching story that explains everything. What are micro-narratives? What? What are micro-narratives? Snapshots, yes. Or local understandings. We have no understanding of what's happening in the world. We can't make it make sense. But we can make sense what's going on in my community or my town or my community, or I would say my tribal group. That those are important. Some people think, is this, again, just Western, this transition? And I would say no. It is transcultural in these ways. Another way to describe this transition is do it in 3: pre-modern, modern, postmodern. And postmodern is similar to pre-modern. It goes back. Importance of community, importance of narratives. And that some of places in the world that we have put down, places in Africa and others who never got to modern, in some ways I'm so thankful for them. They aren't messed up as much as those of us in the West are as we deal with some of these issues. You'll see that one of the things I talk about is that we've moved from a guilt-based culture to a shame-based culture. And a lot of us in the West will need to learn from our Asian brothers and sisters. What does that mean? And the whole question of community in the African American community and in the African continent community, family was never thrown away. It was always there. Community is always important, and we need to learn together. But we're all influenced, whether we like it or not. We're influenced because we can't hide anymore because of systems, and that we have so much communication going on throughout the world that we can't hide. We're all faced with this postmodern emerging culture. So, how do Christians respond to a changing culture? And I think that's helpful for us to realize if we're going to ministry within a changing culture or postmodern culture, we need to realize is there could be some dissonance between myself and the people I minister with. And it could go the whole gamut. So what are the various ways churches and ministries are responding to cultural change today? One is what I would call unchanging tradition. There's no need for change. They see their tradition as linked to the time of Christ. Sometimes jokingly, many times not jokingly, I would use saying, you know, if the King James Bible was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for us. And then my class, leadership class this past summer, I had two people, one ministering in Kentucky and one ministering in West Virginia, saying, yes, that's my church. We use the King James. And I had one woman who was from the mountains of North Carolina, and on Facebook, she used a translation of the Bible. I don't know what she was saying, but it was not King James. And one of her best friends unfriended her because she didn't use the King James version of the Bible. So we can laugh, but for a lot of us, we see nothing's changed. All this is just stuff out there, you know, and we want things like it was. The whole question of let's make America great again. You know, my question for that is, which America? Whose America? Because I might have been growing up in the 50s and 60s privileged, but a number of immigrants, a number of African Americans were not. And so we can't go back to the 50s, or we should not go back to the 50s, because the 50s weren't great. And God calls us to be involved in what He's doing. If God's involved in this change, we need to see how He's involved and how He wants us to be involved. Second, this is just a developmental phase. New ideas are temporary, or a temporary phrase that these young people will outgrow. Youth will eventually be like their elders. The problem with that is it takes about 30 years to find out if you're right or not. So 30 years ago when people respond that way, now some of them are saying, whoops, they aren't just like us. There is something. But that's a second response, is that we don't have to change very much because it's just a developmental phase. These young people will grow up at some point and just be like us. Third is a generational transition. Changes are generational. Boomer, Gen X, millennial. Changes come quickly, will last for only one generation. And again, in the late 80s and 90s, even for a lot of people today, that's the thing they held on to, this generational transition. But again, there are three problems with it. One is the people behind it see it's a cyclical view of history, that it will revert to itself. And we, as Christians, understand that God's kingdom story is moving forward. It's not moving in a circle and eventually not going anywhere, but it's moving forward to bring about His fruition. Secondly, it was very Western. Very Western. As I talk to people from other parts of the world, they have no understanding what we're talking about as we talk about boomers, Xers, and millennial. And it's very quick pace. It changes very quickly. And what I would say is the reason we got into that is there was a major transition for the boomers to the Xers because it was actually the first change of cultures, a change of generations from modern to postmodern. Whereas in the boomers, it actually was the initial transition. By the time the end of the Xers, it was very much postmodern. That was a change. It wasn't this generational change. Although it can be helpful. I'm not downplaying it. But I think it's also, for a lot of people, it's a very nice marketable term that they use to sell lots of products and get people into lots of seminars and things like that. And then there are three responses to the emerging culture. First, there would be what I would call the fortress mentality. There is a unique emerging culture that is different from modern culture. People would agree with that. But the church needs to be protected from this negative development. That the church sees it's happening on the outside. We just don't want it to happen to our kids, to our church. And so we will build a fortress mentality. I'm retired from university, but I still have an interest in what's going on, and especially at UNC Chapel Hill. And so we have a new staff worker that I'm beginning to mentor who on their Facebook group, Facebook page, sent out a request about 3 days ago about praying for us as we reach out and befriend these new students coming on campus. And one of my alums from the 80s wrote back, says, I have a sophomore who's there, and I pray for the campus because she's involved in a liberal such and such campus. And I thought to myself, is that who we created? Alums like that. But again, it's a person who has fear for their kids. So there is some fortress mentality that we should have. The second emerging culture, prophetic voice. Now put my church in Chapel Hill like this. Recognize some positive changes, but most changes are negative. Forewarns churches about negative consequences. And so it can realize some positive things, but most of it is negative, and we need to be prophetic. It'll be interesting because our church, which is about 1,000 and probably has 30 different countries represented, but mostly internationals, and some people from East Asia and from different parts of Latin America and African Americans. But it's fairly white and want to grow and be multi-ethnic. And I'm just beginning to think through is, are we willing to make some changes to have a different viewpoint of how we do ministry and what's important to becoming multi-ethnic? Are we really to reach out and not just be individualistic, but understand about societal injustice and things like that? Time will tell. Sixth response, emerging culture and mission opportunity. Obviously, you will see that's where I would land. God is causing some of these changes for his purposes. Seek mission opportunities to advance the gospel. One of the things I didn't say earlier is that although strategies to do ministry and how we do ministry might change from culture to culture, meaning this paradigm shift from the time of Christ, the gospel doesn't change. God doesn't change. But how we do ministry does change. Let me give you an example. That's from biblical times. I was going to use it later. I'll come back to it later. But have you ever wondered why Jesus spoke more in narrative and parables, and Paul spoke more didactically, doctrinally? Anybody know why? Besides personality? One of the things that I'm beginning to recognize, and some people beginning to recognize, is that Hebrew culture, which Jesus primarily spoke into, is a lot like postmodern culture. Emphasis on heart, emphasis on gut. It's the Hebrew word for gut. And in Greek culture, it's more like modern culture for very reasons. When Paul went to the Areopagus, he gave a regional presentation of the gospel. And so one of the things that I would say is that possibly, and we'll talk about this in the second part when we get to communication, maybe we should spend more time in the narrative portions of Scripture than we are now. I'm not saying we're going through a year in the book of Romans in our church, and we're in chapter 12 now, and we'll finish by Christmas time. And so that's good, but I'd love for us to spend a year in one of the Gospels also. As we're thinking about how to reach a postmodern culture. The gospel doesn't change. How we present it might change. I'm going to give you an exercise to do. 6 responses. Think through. I want you to think through, and I won't extend it as much as I would do in a class, but think through, where do you primarily fit in? And the church you're ministering in or the church you're attending, where do they primarily fit in? We could have all 6 of this as parts of our ministry, and that's fine. But think through unchanging tradition. Really, we want to keep a New Testament church just like it was in Christ's time. The developmental phase. I want to, the young people are just going to get like us later. Generational transitions from boomers to Xers to millennials to Generation Z, or to see, that there's some things in emerging culture that's happening. Fortress mentality, let's hide and build a wall. Prophetic, let's understand some of the things God might be saying, but most of it's negative. Or missional opportunity. So I'm not going to ask you to tell where you are. I want you to do it, but I am going to ask you is how many of you are in dissonance with your church? And you could be in dissonance. I had one student in the leadership class this summer who was more traditional than his church is. And you don't used to see that, but we started dialoguing and began to understand why. So take about a minute. And then what I want you to do, if it doesn't take that long, just turn to somebody next to you and share what where you are in that, where your church is. And we'll come back. As you think about yourself and your church, how many of you are together? Your viewpoint and your church is primarily the same. And the second question, how many is it different? So for how many of you is the church you're involved with is that you're very similar to where your church is as you think about response to emerging culture? So how many would be similar to your church? Raise your hand. Okay. How many would be different than your church? Okay. And one of the things that I think you're going to be involved with, and we'll get to a little bit on this as we get to think about one of the responses, especially the area of leadership. And then my class in foundational leadership, we get into this a lot, is that lots of times it's those of us who are younger, or those of you who are younger, but I can put myself in that category to some degree in terms of affiliation, is that we're very different than our elders or our lead pastor in our church. And I've been involved in working with churches and pastoral staff teams who are at dissonance with each other, especially in the area of leadership, between kind of a modern or emerging understanding of how we do leadership. And so that's part of the conflict we have now and one of the things I pray for is that God will work and bring about these groups of people together. As Leighton Ford is a friend who, about 15 years ago, I put together a whole curriculum on emerging culture and interviewed Leighton. And one of the questions he said is that existing leaders need younger leaders to interpret the changes in society. He worked for Billy Graham for a long time, and he said that's what Billy says. Younger leaders need older leaders to help them in times of hardship, to be able to persevere, to keep going. So we need each other. We shouldn't do battle with each other. We can learn from each of these 6 traditions, but we need to understand how's the culture changing. How do we as Christians respond to that change? Or how is God involved in that change, and how does He want us to be involved? Those are critical questions. Well, let's look at a little bit of the changes. What should be the church's response to each of these cultural values? Move from individual, and I've now changed it to tribes, not community, in that we now live in a society that's very postmodern, but doesn't really involve in community as we would understand community, but what I would call tribes. That tribes, by this I do not mean like Native American tribes and things like that, but people who come together and whose identity is wrapped up in the tribe that they're involved with. And it's very much a we-they mentality. We see this in different places. We see this very much in our federal government, and those that live in North Carolina, and our North Carolina government. And I know people involved in both, and see how we live in these tribal groups and we don't listen to each other. Some way, God wants us as a church to break through that and to bring about Christian community. But for our community, whereas others are exclusive, God calls our community to be inclusive. There's a survey, a poll that came out by, I think, Pew Foundation just this week, asking people who go to church, would you like to go to church with people who believe similar to you politically? And over half said yes. And to me, that'd be so sad. Because again, if we can't grapple with some of these issues within the church and learn how to be ministry outside the church, how to respond, we are no better. And God desires for us, as He did in other times of cultural change, to be the ones who bring about change that God desires to have. The second, the movement from word and image to word and image. It's not either or, that both are important. And so for those of us who are more modern, we need to understand that image is important for lots of people, both within the church, whole area of worship and images within worship, as well as how do we communicate the gospel. But we can't throw out the word either. And that God, within Scripture, has both word, and I'm not talking about the word, but word and image. And for some of us, we need to deal more with image. Some of us need to be dealing more with word within scriptures. Then objective truth to subjective truth to what I would call embodied apologetics is that one of the things that we have to do is I don't think we're going to convince people about truth, which we tried to do in modern times. I'll tell this story, although some of the people here who were involved in when I was dialoguing with the faculty are here today. But one of the things that Tim Liniak and I did a number of years ago is try to build a partnership between university and Gordon-Conwell about training our staff, because I thought they think they do need more theological training. And so we're setting up a group of courses, and I knew this question would come about. And so I found the person who taught the apologetics class here, who no longer teaches it, the person's retired, and explained to him what I was going to say if that question came up. And it did come up. And so they said, what about apologetics? And I said, yes, we do need apologetics. But it's probably not the apologetics that I grew up with, that I became a Christian through reading a book by Frank Morrison called Who Moved the Stone. He was an atheist trying to prove the gospel that Jesus was still in the tomb and then ended up becoming a Christian. He said, those are great questions for the past, but not for the present. For the present, the questions are, where was God when I was raped when I was 14? And we go back to, what's the famous verse we use in apologetics? Anybody know? 1 Peter. Yeah, can somebody say it? Always be ready for what? Give a reason or answer for the hope that's within you. In modern times, we taught it reason. So you can say this verse two ways. Always be prepared to give a reason or answer for the hope that's within you, or always be prepared to give a reason or answer for the hope that's within you. And so one of the things I did was, as a good New Testament scholar or person who passed New Testament classes at Gordon-Conwell, is look at the context. In the context of what Peter is trying to do, it's a group of people who were facing persecution from Rome. And it looked like persecution was coming. It was coming their way from Rome and moving eastward. And they were afraid. They were fearful. And you have Peter, who I love it, because you see Peter from the first trying to stand up, and always be the person with the right answer and things like that. Always to be one standing up for Christ, even trying, when he was arrested, trying to defend Christ through swords. That Peter, if you read First Peter, you will see that it's a pastor now speaking to a group of people who needed hope. That is the type of society we live in. Apologetics, the definition of apologetics, is a proper defense of the gospel that's proper for that period of time. So we need to live the gospel out. That is what's going to people, and part of it is in John, where it talks about they will know you're Christians by the love you have for one another. That's an embodied apologetics. And we'll talk a little bit at the other end as we'll talk about dealing with not just individual morality, but societal justice. That's part of what God calls. And so he wants us to be involved, but maybe not the ways we were involved in the past. And so think through embodied apologetics. It's more living it out versus saying it, which is so much harder to do than just saying the right words, but living it out. And so as we live in tribal groups, we are trying to defend our own tribes, and we as Christians sometimes are no different, is what we need to do is be involved in an inclusive community that reaches and shares the gospel in a variety of different ways, and then lives out the gospel in what we would call embodied apologetics. And then lastly is that move from a meta-narrative, micro-narrative to God's kingdom story. Is that one of the things I began to realize 10 or 15 years ago is the richness of the story of God from Genesis to Revelation. And especially as we think about spiritual formation, is that we need to, and we'll deal with that a little bit also after the break, we need to get away from just doing the right things, but understanding God and who God is. And so we live with a group of people, whether young or old, who do not know the gospel story or the biblical story. And so what we need to do is help them understand God's gospel, God's kingdom story from the beginning to the end. And so I'm working on a book that I've tentatively entitled Identity Transformed, Reclaiming, Reflecting, and Revealing the Image of God. And I want to write it for younger Christians, but to do it in a way that what I think we need to recognize is people are searching for identity. They do not know where their home is. They're searching for a place, and we know that their identity isn't in finding out where they came from, meaning what country and things like that, or just latching on to some little tribal group for safety and survival. But their identity comes because they are women and men created in God's image. And we're called to be ambassadors and witnesses and image bearers for that. We're going to take a little bit of time, about 10 minutes or so, to ask for a question and answer, and we'll have some more time at the end, and we'll take a break at 2:20, come back at 3. And at 3 o'clock, one of the things that we will do is then look at 4 categories. We'll look at the whole area of communication. We'll look at the area of evangelism. We'll look at the area of spiritual formation and leadership. It's 4 categories, and how do we deal with those categories as we think about this? Come up. If I have to stand up here, you can say it. Yes.
What do you think brought about the disembodiment of the gospel that we're experiencing and having to respond to with this embodied apologetic?
Trying what you think in terms of disembodied. One is that in a postmodern world, we live in a world that into the modern world, and even in postmodern world, we live in a world that does not believe in God. When I was at Florida State, one of the God is Dead theologians, when I was a student there, Richard Rubinstein, and then others, is that, and it goes back to Nietzsche, is that they took God out of the equation. And so there's no permanency. There's no transcendency. And so now you end up with pride. You end up with a disembodiment of the gospel. And what we are called to do is bring that picture back, that kingdom story of going back to creation. And to show through creation doesn't mean, in sense, that we as Christians are followers of Christ or followers of Yahweh in the Old Testament. We weren't perfect. No. Sometimes we were the worst. But God kept pursuing us. God kept pursuing his people, and God kept caring for them like he did Habakkuk. And so I think it's a sense of people when God is no longer in the picture, sin still is in the picture, and that we end up in a place where we don't take responsibility. We blame somebody else, whether it's an individual or another group. And that's what's happening in our society today. It's not my fault. It's not my group's or tribe's fault. It's the other people's fault. And so so what we need to do as Christians is embody the gospel. We need to live it out with each other and then in relationships. And that, to me, is a critical question for the next 10, 15 years. And you know what? You're the one that's going to be doing this. It's not going to be my generation, I'm afraid to say, because we don't like change. We like it the way it was. Because when things change, that means my equilibrium is upset. It is funny that I've been involved with this for 30 years, because anybody who knows me, I don't like change. We lived in the same house for 30 years. For the last 25 years, the only cars that I have bought are Toyota Camrys. Our kids now drove them and things like that. So I just don't like change. So I think God had a sense of humor, put me in a place that I couldn't just live like I wanted to without change, but put me in a place that I had to change. And I think that's what he does to us. He upsets our equilibrium so that we have to be dependent upon him and then to be his ambassadors. Other questions? Good question.
So
word and image, I think of word being teaching, preaching. What are ways to engage image as a part of our church life?
Okay, it's a great question. I'm not sure I can fully answer it, but a number of years ago I spent some time with a woman named Sally Morgenthaler, who has done a lot of work of thinking through in the area of worship where image fits in. And so what I think would be from simple things, it's not simple, that's the wrong word, but having dance, within it, having the songs that we sing be image songs, and not just not just a prelude to the sermon, but to have it all fit in so that there's a thematic there. That we even videos, and I'm thankful that our church at least shows some videos that will highlight things. But I think it's also the sense of God's creation, of having, one of the things we did in our church is we had people both in photography, then also in art. And in art, it wasn't painting, second time it was painting, where they drew images of God's creation, painted it and put them up. And a lot of people didn't know the artists in our church. And the same thing with dance and things like that. So incorporate some of those things, which will make those of us who think there should be 45-minute sermons, which our lead pastor does in our church, they're going to have to understand you're going to have to give up something. And I'm not sure I'm going to win the fight on that within our church, but hopefully you can win the fight within your churches. The preaching is important, but it's the all-encompassing worship. Anybody else? Yes.
You talk about the emerging culture. Do you see that more as a Western thing, or is that crossed into the Asian and other ethnicity as well?
Great question. And that's why I really did not appreciate the generational transition, because it wasn't cross-cultural. Give you just a small example, then I'll tell you a couple stories. One is you'll see first part of next hour that we're moving from a guilt-based culture to a shame-based culture in the Western world. And what we've got to realize is that as people from the East Asia and other places who we're going to have to learn from them, is what it means to live in a shame-based culture, and how do we not get just stuck in it. And so that I think God uses different places in the African-American community, where community or family has always been important. We're going to have to learn from them. So one of the things I think God's doing is putting those of us who thought we had positions of power or we knew all the answers, we're going to have to be learners. And so I do think it's cross-cultural. I have one of my staff who did a dissertation at Fuller in the area of East Asia and ministry there. A lot of it was centered around postmodern ministry, and so as she went to China, Japan, and had students coming from that, began to realize it's very much a part of that. We see it sometimes where you can see it within the States is when I'm working with a Asian American student, I ask what generation you are. And when they said first, okay, that's one thing. If they say second or third, then I think, okay, you're probably in a dissonant situation. And you're dealing with some of the things of a modern, postmodern. You might not call it that, but two different views where there's unchanging tradition and we need to change. So I think it's there.
We have a question from
Yes.
from our
Oh, good.
remote attendees.
I love it.
It is, what is the best way to evangelize those who want to be spiritual but want nothing to do with their parents', in quotes, religion or churches?
Good question. I will answer it a little bit more next, but I'll give you an example of this. One of the critical things is that that everybody, like Joan, are searching to belong. And one of the things as we think about evangelism in a modern time, you believed before you belonged. In a postmodern world, a lot of times we belong before we believe. That we need to be a part of a group. We need to be invited to see it in action, to see it embodied. And that's then when we will be willing to listen and grapple with the gospel. A number of years ago at UNC Chapel Hill, because InterVarsity was so large and a couple of other Christian groups, there was a group formed called the Pagan Fellowship, little group organized on campus. And one of my friends on crew staff at that point, Campus Crusade, came up to me and said, "You wouldn't believe it." I said, "What?" "The president of the pagan group is interested in Jesus." But I just can't get him farther than that. And that's why I asked two questions. Have you or any of your students been to the pagan fellowship? No. Well, why would we do that? I said, you need to get to understand their community. Have you invited him to a crew meeting or to y'all's small groups or even large groups? No, I'm not sure. Some of the people would feel, they'd feel uneasy about inviting him. But the critical question, he says the person, staff said, he believes in Jesus, but he's just not willing to leave his friends. I said, that's a critical thing because it's much as important that you're moving from one community to another community than you are in terms of what you're believing. And so what he was stuck with is, if I become a follower of Jesus, I have no community. My pagan friends will disown me, and the Christians aren't willing to accept me yet. To me, it's kind of a little bit like Saul might have been when he became a follower of Jesus on the Damascus Road. If it hadn't been for Barnabas, where would Saul have been? Where would the church be? So that's how I respond to the question.
All right, we have another question.
Okay, one more.
All right, and it is, how does this impact individual discipleship?
Again, we'll look at that when we talk about spiritual formation. I think that's the missing link at this point in time. Again, when I was growing up, which is very modern, one of the books that we used was The Fight by John White, where it had different themes, and we'd take our students through this. It was so great. But it was very isolated in the sense was, okay, let's look at sex, let's look at what it means to be a witness and all the other things. But what it was missing was the larger picture, God's kingdom story. Is that what people need to realize is they need to put their story into God's kingdom story. And so that we have a much bigger picture of what we want a follower of Christ to be now than we did when I was a young staff worker at our church, working at our church and working with the varsity staff. All I wanted to do was have people change their actions. And here is really, they need to change their perspective on life and see God at work from Genesis through Revelation. One of the things I wanted to pick up from last session is that, you remember I talked about 1968 as a pivotal year, and that God's actively involved in bringing about cultural change, even when we don't realize it. Well, it was my freshman year at UNC, at Florida State, and I was becoming a leader in university. And university used to have a magazine they put out monthly called His Magazine. You got to realize it was the 60s and 50s when it first came out. So, but that in November of 68, one of the first times they ever did this, had a major series of articles on small groups. InterVarsity, soon afterwards, one of the things that's not well known is that the small groups within InterVarsity, at that time, there weren't small groups in churches, so the students would graduate, become alums, and start small groups in churches. Before that, there was Bible studies, but not necessarily small groups. One of the things I ended up doing over a 20-year period of time is help write 3 small group leaders' handbooks. First one in 1978, I had at that point 30 small groups, 60 small group leaders, but there was no training, and so that's the first time I ever wrote something. Which is funny in one sense because I had a professor at Gordon-Conwell, Richard Lovelace, who taught church history, and I did a paper for him called Charles Finney and the Frontier Camp Revival Meetings of the early 1800s. Got the paper back and said, good content, but your writing style shows you too could have come from the Frontier Camp Revival meeting times. Never thought I was a writer before then. Certainly didn't think I was afterwards. And then I helped write these 2 small group leaders' handbooks. Ended up, when I was doing my doctorate of ministry, my 2 professors with a man at Gordon were Dick Peace and Richard Lovelace. I didn't say anything to Richard Lovelace at the time initially, but Dick Peace said, you need to put this in writing. And I said, I will do it, but can I write it? I'll have all the things you need, but can I write it that people would read it? He said, yes. And so I started doing that my 4th year. And we had a banquet because we were together for 3 years, or 4 years, but three different sessions. We were together for 2 weeks, a group of 25 of us. So I was asked to MC the banquet, and Richard Lovelesson's wife was sitting right there. And so I decided to take the time, whether it was probably a little cruel on my part, but anyway, to remind Richard of that story. And he just bowed his head and said, I said some stupid things back then, because this was 20 years earlier. All I'd say is that what happened with his magazine, I'm convinced now, looking back, was God understanding what was moving from modern to postmodern, while community and Christian community and small groups were going to be critical for the church and ministry in this time, is that although the editors of his magazine, I'm sure, had no idea, but God used them to write these articles, both for the States, but also one of the articles was from David Adeney, who was in Singapore and China at the time, to help not only the United States, but worldwide the small group movement, which has been very critical for the church, and especially critical as we think about this postmodern world and emerging world, and how do we do ministry within that. So that God does things we never know that he's doing, uses us sometimes we never know that. Are we willing just to be open, to God? Am I willing to be open to go back and do writing like this Emerging Hope book, and then Small Group Leaders Handbook and Leadership book, when I just didn't want to take the risk. God wants us to take risks because it causes us to be dependent upon him. Now, from existing emerging leaders, we're going to look at 4 categories. The first one's going to be leadership. And again, I teach a class here called Foundations of Leadership that many of you, or most of you in ministry, not in counseling, but in ministry programs, you don't have a choice. You've got to take my class. So I know I have people coming to the class who might not be glad they're there, but I think all of them leave really glad they're there. But one section that we do is look at the difference between existing and emerging leaders. And one of the things I'm convinced as we move and transition more, and sometimes the church is sometimes behind the times, is that one is, and I do a lot of work in this book called The Leadership Jump, of talking about existing and emerging leaders, that we need each other. Leighton was right that the younger leaders need the wisdom of the older leaders, but the older leaders need the wisdom of the creativity of the younger leaders. And eventually, that we as older existing leaders need to hand over the ministry to the younger leaders. Having talked to some of you are in situations where that's happening or should be happening right now in your own churches. It's not. So let me just help us think through these 6 categories. One is, in the existing, there was a sense of heroic leadership that you look at in World War II, you look in the 50s, you look in the 60s. There were heroic leaders. But probably since the early 70s, if you take away sports, entertainment, who are the heroes? Not only in the United States, but other parts of the world. The one I can think of is probably Nelson Mandela, who was a heroic leader. But for most of the other people, it's not. There aren't heroic leaders anymore. They're post-heroic, which isn't bad. It's actually good in this sense. For heroic leaders, too often, not necessarily, but too often, we end up having, be excited about the power. And instead of having a sense of servanthood, we have a sense of leadership and over people. And that's so we become heroic leaders. And we've seen too often heroic leaders fall. At InterVarsity in the 80s, everybody was excited when a man by the name of Gordon-Conwell, who was, had been pastor at Grace Chapel in New England, in Lexington, Massachusetts, was kind of a hero for a lot of the students when I was there. Ended up leading Vision. World Vision for a while, being one of their major. Then came on the university staff as president. He became the hero for a lot of our staff because, again, working in a parachurch group, a lot of times people sometimes, not as much now, treated second-class citizens. Oh, you don't work for a church, you work for a parachurch. And so people are excited to have somebody of caliber. And then Gordon failed. It came out a couple of years into his presidency that he had had an affair right before he became president. My wife and I spent a lot of time caring for them after that, and took 4 years before they would come back and speak. Finally, the fourth year, I was meeting Gordon in New York City, where I was supervising our regional director in New York. I said to Gordon, because I ask him every year, I do two things, have lunch, breakfast or lunch with he and his wife, and I say, these are the three things God used you to while you were president of the varsity. Every time Gail, his wife, would nudge him and say, I told you so, because he didn't feel like he accomplished anything. And every time I'd ask him, would you come speak to our regional staff conference? Because I knew he knew I was a safe person. He would say no and no. So the final time I said to Gordon, to be honest, 75% of my staff weren't on staff when you were president. And 50% of my staff have no idea who you are. That's like, okay, take him down. And so he came. It was good for him. But again, as a heroic leader, we put people on pedestals. We'll do that for our senior pastor who's been in our church for many years. Some of you are facing that within your ethnic churches where you're dealing with that. Or especially in some places, it's the person who started the church who's still there 30 years later. And so the gifts you needed when you planted the church aren't the same gifts you needed many years later. And so the post-heroic leaders are very critical and very important. But they're not the ones seeking the limelight. They're the ones who are servants. I would put Barnabas as a very much of a post-heroic leader. He never had the limelight in the early church, but he, through his gifts, through mentoring Paul, through mentoring John Mark and others, he basically set up the environment for Paul and some of the other leaders. And so what we need to be helping people to do now is to recognize as a servant leader, a post-heroic leader, is very critical for people today, as you will see in a few minutes as I describe some of the other changes. As part of that, as again in existing leaders, many of us are guarded. We're not willing to open up. We even, especially in New England and even some places in the South, is the pulpit is like 10 feet high. And part of that is kind of like as in the Puritan time, is they're speaking for God. And so you're above all the people. And so you're speaking down to the people. And you don't share about yourself. You grew up in a church that never had sharing. But in an emerging time, people need leaders to be vulnerable. It doesn't mean that you share everything every Sunday morning or every mentoring situation you have or on your elder board or leadership team or whatever, but be willing to share appropriately. And the reason for that is for people growing up in emerging culture is that, one, they don't have a trust for leaders. Leadership is not very well, it's not a high category now. We'll see a little bit later, people don't want to be leaders. And the reason isn't, for a lot of younger people, is if we have leaders who are not vulnerable, is there two things. Is one, I can't share anything about me because what would they think of me? They have never had any problems in their life. Or, probably more likely, how could I open up with them and live under their leadership because I know they're a hypocrite. They never share about what's going on in their lives. We see this, we see this in the Catholic Church right now as they're dealing with tremendous sexual issues from priests. But those of us in Protestants, we're no different in a lot of ways. So we need to be vulnerable. We need to be vulnerable with other people. One of the things I could serve because I wasn't in churches, but I understood it, is that for a number of church pastors in the Triangle area, which is Chapel Hill, Durham, and Raleigh, where I live, is that I was a safe person for them to talk with because I understood them. We were friends, we were peers, but I wasn't involved in their church or in leadership, wasn't the head pastor of another church. And so I became a listening ear to a number of them who were willing to be vulnerable with me and grow. And so we need those, especially for those of us who are younger leaders, we might not see models of people who have been vulnerable, but we need to do that with the people we're ministering to, because if not, they will probably be less likely to share with us. I gave a talk a number of years ago now where it was on sex. And so I talked to the students about how I struggled with masturbation, and even in college, even when I was a leader within a varsity as a student. And at the end of the talk, it was God, I'm sure, convinced me to do this. I said to people, I said, I know you have gone through struggles, especially in the area of sexuality, that you've never shared with anybody else. Find somebody who you know well in this room and share with them. I didn't think a lot about it, although I prayed that they would do that. Got a call the next day from two of my student leaders. One was my president of the chapter, and that's what we called our fellowships, and one was another person in the executive or leadership role. They said, we need to talk. I said, okay. So they came over about half an hour later and said, we did what you said. What do we do now? One of them had shared that they had been raped by their uncle from age 6 to age 18, and nobody knew. And the reason she was willing to share it now is she was thinking her niece the same thing was happening by this uncle. The other person shared is, I had an affair with my music teacher my senior year in high school. Ended up, he and his wife got a divorce. And the only 3 people who know about it was myself, the former wife, and him. What do we do? I knew I was way over my head. And so we brought, for the person who'd been raped and who had think it was still happening, I talked to her parents and got them to talk to the local authorities. The other person, we got both of them in counseling and began to work through it. But it was inside of them. It took somebody who's willing to be vulnerable themselves in a situation that maybe that's not normal to have people to start open up. And so we need to be appropriately vulnerable to the people we lead so that then they will actually be willing to let us lead. Because in existing time, if you were a leader, if you were a pastor, oh, you're the pastor, or you're so-and-so. When I was coming down here, I still don't understand this, but there was a license plate from Delaware that was just auctioned for $400,000 because it was number 20. And you see in Delaware, the governor has number 1, lieutenant governor number 2, the secretary of state number 3, and therefore this was number 20, which meant they were a very powerful person. Why somebody still want that license plate put it on, I still don't know. But it was, again, a positional authority. Whereas today, most people in power is a sense of that positional authority. Is that something they accept? And so we need to earn their authority. We need to, again, be vulnerable. We need to reach out. We need to be servant. We need to be apostoloric. And that we will earn their authority. Now, the scary thing is you will have much more authority than you will if you really earn it. And so I think some of the cults that are happening, especially in the past, were people who not appropriately earned authority with people and used that power inappropriately. But I know from my students and my staff, as well as people in the church, is that once I earned their authority, once I was a servant, once I was not in a position of power, but I would do the small things that would help them to see that I was not just telling other people to do things, but anything I asked people to do, I was doing it myself, that I would earn their authority. Just because, as I tell people, staff, is just because I'm the regional director, my students and staff didn't care anything about that. But because of the way they saw I led and cared for people, they did care about that. So how do you lead? How does your pastor lead? Is it really an earned authority, or we just rest on a position? Again, in the church in the modern time, the existing leaders, we emphasize within the church tasks. Okay, what's the role of the deacons? What are the role of the elders? What are the role of different committees? Roberta Hessenus, who was at Fuller and then the Eastern Seminary, wrote a book called Turning Task Groups or Committees into Communities, where she's saying what we need to have within the church is communities. We need to have teams of people working together who are building relationships with each other so they aren't just task-oriented. So the times I was chair of the board of elders, I would spend the first half an hour of an hour and a half meeting talking about how you're doing and praying for each other. First, they thought I was crazy. Okay, where's the business? Why aren't we supposed to be doing the business? I said, well, no, I think at first we need to build a community. Because if we look at Jesus, he spent 3 years building a community with the disciples. And should our leadership and how we function as leaders be any different than what Jesus did? And as we live in this culture today where the community is important, it's important for us too. And so we spent time praying with each other and sharing with each other. Funny thing happened. We got the business done a lot quicker because we were committed to caring for each other. We aren't just having a different opinion on an agenda. We became a community that wanted to work together to accomplish God's purpose versus a task that had different opinions of how we're going to accomplish that. So within your church, or whether you're working with the youth or others, what's the role of community? Do it with your kids. As parents, is that bring them into a community. One of the things that I did when I was young, parent, even when my kids were 3 or 4 years old, I would ask for their forgiveness if I said something wrong. I yelled, raised my voice, even though they might have deserved all of it. But I would go back and ask for forgiveness. And I did that 2 days ago with our grandson, who's 12. Betsy and I take care of Asher and Karis all summer so their mom and dad can work. And so, we were just tired. Been a long summer. Asher and Karis got it on each other. I got upset. I yelled, told him to go to his room. So the next day, or later on that day, because I didn't want to leave, he was sitting out in the swing in a carport, and I said to him, Asher, let's talk. And he's not the most talkative. 12-year-old guys are not the most talkative. But I said, Asher, what could I have done differently? And he shared some good things. You shouldn't have yelled. And you should have listened to me. Then I could ask the question, what could you have done differently? And so it's an earned authority. It's a community that we have built with our grandkids, to the point where Betsy was taking them home on Friday. Asher had he's a very sensitive kid, had his sweatshirt over his face, crying, because he knew that summer was over and they were going back to school. We had built a community. How are we building a community with the groups that we're leading? And it's not a tribal group. It's a community that is reaching out to other people. Fifth is moving from directing to empowering. Again, for those of us who are heroic leaders who lead from positional authority, we have a sense to direct people. We have the idea, we call people to do it, and typically we micromanage it. So so that when they don't do it correctly, we take it over from them instead of empowering them. I have a tendency to do that. My staff knew when I did that was at the beginning of summer camp when we'd have 600 people coming in 2 weeks, for a 2-week period of time. Those first 2 days is getting everything set, is my staff knew that those are my times of vulnerability, my kind of natural desire to micromanage come in. So I had to do a lot of apologizing until about 10 years ago, and I'd said to God, God, my parents can die anytime except February. We're doing we have a week of staff recruitment where we do interviews, or summer camp. So my dad entered the hospital 5 days before summer camp, never came out. And so I had to set up camp, spend 3 or 4 hours working with somebody, and then leaving it. And then we went from Greensboro to Columbia, did not know when we entered the door if my dad would still be alive. He lived for 3 more days. Camp got going. We got there, and all the staff in the Young Life said to them, you don't do anything this week. You and Betsy be in the guest lodge, and they bought flowers for us. And what I learned from there is I don't have to direct, I can empower. So God used a vulnerable time to help me understand this lesson, which I've continued to learn and continue to live on. So are we willing to raise up people, to bring them into leadership, to mentor them, and then to empower them so God can use the gifts of the whole team to accomplish the person, so that one of the things I didn't want, whether it's in the church or in a varsity, I didn't want any Jimmy Longs running around. When I came on staff at UNC Chapel Hill, I got there was 200 people. The person before me had taken it from 2 to 200. And two things happened. One, I asked him, what should I do? He said, I don't have no idea because I'm leaving now. Good luck. Literally. Now, I found out later he planted 3 churches. So we realized after looking back is he has the gifts of a planter, but not a builder. And so the other thing that I found out from him is that one of the top leaders was called Little Donnie Bryant. His name is Bobby Gross, but it's Little Donnie Bryant. And Bobby and I are still good friends. He was over at our house. He's head of faculty for InterVarsity, but came and stayed with us a couple of weeks ago. But it helped me to realize I don't want any Jimmy Longs, because they might have my strengths, but they also have my weaknesses. I want a lot of people who really look up to Jesus and not to me. And part of that is empowering people. So how are we empowering people to do the ministry? Again, in existing leaders, modern churches, we're dealing with destinations. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? What's it going to look like we're going to be there? And I was very good at that. But then as I looked at this, as we moved into this emerging culture and began to ask lots of questions without a lot of answers, I began to realize we're on a journey, which I know the ultimate destination, but I don't know the destination for the next 2, 3, or 4 years. Am I willing to allow God to guide us, and be on a journey, and do I trust Him? That really is what Habakkuk had to deal with. Do I trust God because He's been faithful in the past? Will I trust Him in the future, present and future? Now, we don't know what happened to Habakkuk, but the Babylonians came in. They wiped out Jerusalem. They went to the exile. But my guess is Habakkuk still worshiped God. That I don't understand where, necessarily the destination, but I'm willing to be on the journey that you will lead. Are we willing to be journey guides? One of the books that people read for the foundations class, it just came out a couple years ago, called Canoeing the Mountains by Todd Bolzinger, who works at Fuller. Now, what he didn't know was Leadership Network about 5 years earlier that I went to, had a whole week-long seminar basically on looking at Lewis and Clark as examples of how they had a certain understanding what leadership was going to be, where they were going, and where they ended up. In the book, Todd's book, Canoeing the Mountains, said we basically took canoes thinking we were going up the river and didn't realize we had to go over the mountains. And after a while, it took them a while, they dropped the canoes to the side and realized we're on a journey, we don't know where we're going to end up, but we're going to trust. And so, are we comfortable enough to empower people to be willing to be on a journey together where we need the gifts and the community of all of us working together? Sometimes you have board of trustees or elders that don't want you to do that, and it might take convincing. So I've had to go into a couple of churches, helping them understand the whole question of journey by taking them to the scriptures and look at especially the Old Testament. Or you look in the New Testament. Dr. Hollinger talked about the book of Acts. That was a journey. They might have known where they were going to end up, but they didn't know what was going to happen along the way. They didn't know how Gentiles fit into this. They didn't realize in terms of how Saul became Paul and how he fits into that. It was a journey that caused them to be dependent upon each other and upon God, and using the gifts each of them had. And then lastly, one of the things we've got to recognize is that in my generation, probably people aspired to be leaders. People wanted to be leaders. They looked up to leaders. I want to be a leader like them. But because of in secular culture and in churches, and I see people don't want to be leaders. So instead of aspiring to be leaders, we as leaders, one, we have to model what good leadership is and what community is like, and to say, I want to be a part of that group. And so we have to inspire them. So as you're looking at elders or looking at staff people in the coming year, or if you're in parachurch, looking at small group leaders, is you need to be mentoring people for a couple of years ahead of time. And within your mentoring and in your discipleship of them, helping them have a vision of what God might want to do in them and through them as a leader. So that by the time they're being asked to be leaders, they might not have aspired to it, but they've been inspired by your mentoring of them. And therefore, the good news of that, if you mentored a lot of people who are leaders, you don't have to direct them, is that you've already given them a vision that yours or the existing groups, and you can empower them to be on this journey with you. So existing to emerging leaders is one area. You can come back to this in a little bit. Second area is communications. I won't spend a lot of time on this because I'm probably not as skilled in this area, but word and image, didactic and narrative. Again, if I was doing a PhD now, I would love to do a PhD in the difference between Jesus' preaching and Paul's preaching based upon the culture that they were primarily ministering within. It'd be fascinating because you have two people in a short period of time having very different, the goal's the same, the gospel's the same, but their preaching style was different. And I think it's because of the culture. And so we need to wrestle with our culture. And part of our culture, I think, is more like the Hebrew culture. And so the narrative is important. And the reason for that is if you live in a culture that you do not initially believe in truth, some way you've got to kind of break people's defenses and help them to realize the importance of how people have changed, lives have changed, and then they're willing to listen for the truth. In the early 80s, InterVarsity had grown so large at UNC Chapel Hill that I, and then working with some students, began to think through is, how can we radicalize the campus and have the campus talking about the gospel? And so we had the crazy idea to invite Billy Graham to come in for a week. It took 3 years to convince him to do it, but he finally did, to come in. And we had the people talking about the gospel. But we saw God's hand at work beforehand in some ways that we would not have thought. One is, I was the initial person who was involved in leading the charge, but it needed to become students. And so I was going to go with two of my students, and one of my heroes within InterVarsity was the regional director, a guy named Jim Burney, became the national director in Canada a few years later, to go to Cambridge, England, my expenses paid through InterVarsity, to watch a Billy Graham mission at Cambridge University. 4 days before we were supposed to go, my wife, my young son, my young daughter all got sick. Different things, but all got sick. And I realized I can't go. It's a priority question and things like that. They needed me there. What would I say if I went? And so I sent my two students off with Jim Burney, and they came back. And I sat in the back of the room because the students had raised the money for them to come. And so they shared about the trip. And by the end of the hour and a half they shared, I was in tears in the back of the room. Because here were two people who went into the trip excited, but hadn't caught the vision, came back and caught the vision, and helped the other 100 students catch the vision. And so, again, a sense of kind of forced empowering for me. And so that we carried on out. We were fearful of Graham's crusade directors come in and kind of lead it, because we wanted this new kind of understanding of what a mission looks like. And so we had to meet with the head of the Vice President of Student Affairs, and he said, I'll approve this on one condition, that it's student-led. And I almost laughed. I said, would you put that in writing? So we did. He did. So then we could show it to the crusade director, who they put to kind of supposedly guide us, but be the envoy between the Graham organization and us. And so God, time and again, did different things. 6 months beforehand, the head of the student who was head of it was Sandy Ford, who was Leighton Ford's son, and Leighton worked with Billy Graham, and Billy Graham was his uncle, and brilliant guy. Had to have a heart surgery in Thanksgiving weekend. I was in Washington, got a call from Leighton Wednesday night and said, Sandy died. You know, most of me was so concerned about Sandy and Leighton and Jean. Part of me was concerned, it's God, what are you doing? Here's our leader. What's going to happen? He was going to lead this. But again, God raised up other people to lead it. Again, we had the person in place, a guy by the name of Jim Hummel, who was going to be editor of the student newspaper, which is the kind of place to lead. He ended up, we had to postpone the mission, and he was no longer editor, but he'd been editor for a year. And so, and brought salt and light in there. And so then we had this student who was kind of commissioned by the paper to be the person writing. And so the editorial the first day, I said, you need to call them up. I could not have written a better editorial of inviting people to come. And then day in and day out, the newspaper, I could not have written a better article. The last day was the only day we had people stood up. This newspaper reporter stood up. He had become a Christian that week. Okay, God, it was much better than Jim doing it. And so, well, in a sense, in this journey, be willing to see God at work and allow God to do things and to be willing to be transformational. I'm going to rush a little bit. Authoritative, authentic. Again, going back to vulnerable in a lot of ways, that we need to be ourselves in who we are, both with our strengths and weaknesses. We need to be part, if we're the preacher, we need to be a part of the person who's wrestling with the text. So my pet peeve, and our pastor did this for a while. First pastor did it all the time. Second did for a while. Would say, now, when there's some type of application, you need to be doing this or you need to be doing that. And slowly he changed and started saying we. So he put himself into the text, into the application. If any of you ever preach, if I'm ever there and you're talking about you, not we, I will probably come up to you. But again, the sense of we're authentic. We need to be ourselves. We're in this community. We're in this journey together. The importance of communication is not knowledge, but transformation. Is that, and in the modern world, we wanted more knowledge. In a postmodern world, I'm thankful that students want more transformation. So the book I'm writing is Identity Transformed, is that we need to be transformed people so we can live out our faith. And then the movement from reason to hope. When we did the Billy Graham mission, we called it Reason to Live. And I think it was appropriate in the early 80s. If I had done it 15 years later, I would have called it an offer of hope. Because that, as we moved in a postmodern world, is that we need to be people who give hope to other people. Part of the communication, instead of being inward focused, how can I grow, is to be outward focused. How can God mobilize us as a community to reach out and do ministry, not just within our own church, but in our community around us. We are God's ambassadors, not just for the church, but to the community. So then how does this work in evangelism? We move from, in modern times, it's a sense of Great Commission, which you all know. What I didn't know for a number of years was that Great Commission, obviously it's in Scripture, but it wasn't used as kind of a rallying cry until early 1800s, late 1700s with John Carey and others and missionaries. About the same time that England and other people were building colonies. And so commission talks about something we need to go, we need to do. Whereas I'm convinced when somebody asks Jesus, what's the greatest, commandment, he shares the great commandments about loving God and loving others. Both are part of evangelism. But the emphasis, I think, today needs to be, as we think, it's a great commandment. How do we as a community love God and through God's love in us, love other people? Second, my generation, we believed before we belonged. We would sit there and we would look at, and hear and reasonably think through the Scriptures. Lee Strobel, who some of you might know from Willow Creek, who's done a lot of work in evangelism. That's how he became a Christian later in life. He sat in the back of Willow Creek and listened and reasoned, and so he became a Christian through the reasoning process. Then he become part of the church, and that's how he taught for many years. Whereas in a postmodern world, people need to see it in action because they don't believe the truth yet. They need to see it lived in action. They need the embodied apologetics before they believe. So for my generation, we believed, we accepted Christ as Savior, but a lot of times we never accepted Christ as Lord of our lives. For this generation's, that's not going to happen. They accept Jesus and what He is and what He does. But I think the Achilles heel for this generation is they will belong, they will become converted to the community. And then they might leave that community, and they look like a Christian, act like a Christian, smell like a Christian. They must be a Christian. But they leave that community, go some other place, and you wonder, where's their faith? Why did they drop out of the church? Because what they had done is we allowed them to be converted to the community, but not to the King of the community, to Jesus. And so that's a critical place we can't, as to bring them into community, let them see it, but make sure they understand the importance of the cross and their sin and their rebellion. Guilt to justification, shame to adoption. When I was writing my doctoral thesis, I wasn't even planning to do a theological section, but I did. My second chapter dealt with, instead of looking at guilt and justification, which we look in the modern time, that I began, you got to realize this is 25 years ago, I began to see that really shame and adoption, which also in Scripture is probably the better kind of analogy to use. And so Rick Lentz, who's now our head of faculty, head of academics, I'd gotten to know Rick. I'd asked Rick to be one of the people I'd defend my thesis with. I had to send it, called him a couple of days later. I said, Rick, the first question I have for you is, am I a heretic? Because it's very different. We're talking about saying that shame and adoption is probably more important right now than guilt and justification. He said, nope, you're not a heretic. Okay, we can talk. But the shame deals with the relationship. It's not that I've done something wrong, which I have, but there's something wrong with me. And people need to grapple with that. By just telling them that I've done certain things, that's not going to get at their heart issue. They need to see, because they don't have a place to belong, they don't have a home, they need to see that the gospel provides a place for them to belong. They are, as they become followers of Christ, they become adopted into God's family and to the family within the church, or should be in the church around them. And began to see the powerfulness of dealing with shame. So go back and read Genesis 1 through 3. There's not a lot of guilt talked about there, but it's a lot about shame. And then in Romans, read the sections dealing with guilt, but also read the sections dealing with shame and adoption. It's both there. We don't do away with the gospel, but I think a more appropriate for lots of people today is recognizing what it means to be a person of shame and need to be adopted. In a modern world, we present the truth now, again, more knowledge, whereas in a postmodern world, we need to give a sense of eternal hope because people have no hope now. And then we've talked already, classical apologetics to embodied apologetics. Let me get to the last one because I want a few times for questions. Guilt to shame and spiritual formation is, emphasis the whole question of the people I work with, whether older or younger, it's really the issue they're dealing with is shame now, not guilt. We've got to help them get back to make sure they understand the guilt and the sin and to go to the cross. But that for them, it's something even far deeper. There's something wrong with me. When Adam and Eve sinned, they went and hid, and there were people before with no shame, and now there were people with shame. They hid from God because of not their guilt, but their shame. And so then the justification and adoption. We need to bring them in community, and so spiritual formation isn't just a mentoring of one person to another person and bringing in a community. And then we need to understanding of what's to put off, but also to put on. We've done a lot of work in the area of sins that we need to stop doing, but we haven't done as much of the things we should be doing. So one of the things I did was take students when we did a class called Identity Transformer track, is I got them, and I wasn't sure how this was going to work the first time I did it, is we were in Colossians. So I got them anytime during the week of what are the things they wanted to put on the cross. The things to put off, the ones to put on the cross, knowing that Jesus died for that. And then on the other side is what do they want to put on? What is the type of people God's calling them to be? Now, that was a risk on my part. For the first half of the week, or 3/4 of the week, a few people put things up, not many. So I said, this morning, we're going to do this. And so a number of people put things on, And then some hadn't, and I said, you don't have to do it. But every person, said, no, give me time. And so they did that. And so what I asked them to do is to put the things on the cross and said, take the things that are over here and put them on your blouse or your shirt and wear it for the rest of the day, the end of camp. Because that's the person God's calling you to be. They were powerful things they said. So we need to be helping people not only is to put things off, but to put things on. What are the type of people they're calling to be? And part of it is that we need to not just deal with individual morality, which is important. But in a modern church, a lot of times that's all we did as evangelicals. We dealt primarily with the individual morality, but didn't think about societal morality or societal justice. One, we need to repent of that, because that's not the full gospel if you read the scriptures. And secondly, if you're going to bring people in who are postmoderns who do not grow up in the church, they need to see that. Too often we as a church are no different than another tribal group. And it's important to do. I used to do a debate with a man by the name of Fred Brooks, who was if anybody knows anything about computers, he was the chief engineer of what's called the IBM 360 computer, which is the forerunner of all the computer systems we have in the 50s. Worked for IBM. If he'd stayed with IBM, I'm convinced that he would have been president in the 80s and 90s. But he came to UNC Chapel Hill, was a Christian, became a Christian later, a little bit later in life. So became as a Christian. So I got to know him when I went there. And as we started talking, again, this person's brilliant. Now it's a building named after UNC. But I took a risk and said, Fred, what if we, this is kind of a year of elections. You have to realize he's also one of my major donors. If we have a debate between conservative and liberal, Republican, Democrat, in terms of Christians, how we stand as Christians as we think about this election coming up. He said, sure. So with fear and trembling, I did that. First thing I said was, I need to say, is that as a Christian who would be more liberal or a Democrat, I need to repent of a part of the party's platform is abortion is wrong. And as a Christian, I cannot condone that platform. But one of the things I do like about the Democrats is that they care for the second part of life once birth happens, and too often us as evangelicals, we don't have that concern. So I saw Fred coming, getting ready to come up and thought, just saw his eyes. So we did it 4 years later, and Fred started off and said, I just want to start out by saying that as a Christian who's a Republican, is that we need to care for the poor. And the Republican platform, Republican Party doesn't care for the poor. I thought, good, you learned that, Fred. But it's a sense of societal justice is critical. And it doesn't mean we take a party's platform or something, but we need to grapple with the scriptures and what the scriptures say of how we to live the gospel out, not just individually, but collectively. If we do that, we're going to be one of the few models of what that, what it means for people willing to hear the gospel. I'll share the story real quickly. At Davis, because I just talked to our new staff worker there. A number of years ago, university was kicked off campus because we had a policy, still do, that leaders who were committed members of the LGBT community and who practice in that, not just couldn't be in leadership, loved to be involved. And so one of our leaders said, yes, I am gay, I'm practicing, and we said, we'd love for you to stay involved, but you can't be a student leader. He got upset, people in the student government got upset, and so they took it before the student government. And the university was voted 18-15 to be kicked off campus. And we knew it was coming. We had some plans if that happened. But they had to have a second vote. And so the student leader in the LGBT community asked student government, can I speak before you make a vote? Oh yeah, we'd love for you to. So they were there thinking he would rile them up again. He said, I totally oppose this vote. InterVarsity, although we disagree, in this area, and we've made it clean, both sides have made it for people to see that, but we've done dialogues. They've reached out to us, they cared for us, but we also know where they stand. I think they're the best organization in relationship to our community. They need to stay. I don't know what the final vote was, but it was very much for us to say, because the community was willing to deal with social justice and be willing to take risks and to deal with issues that they didn't necessarily know how to end, but they knew how to enter into dialogue with. Or didn't know how solutions, but the dialogue without giving up their beliefs. Move from witness to image bearer. Witness is one who points to people, points to Jesus. I want to point to Jesus, point you to them. Image bearer is much more important for that. I don't think she's here now. She was here this morning, but Catherine McDowell, as you know her, was one of my former students at UNC Chapel Hill, and so she learned a lot from me. But when I was starting writing this book, Identity Transform, I knew about her dissertation, so I said, Kathy, can I come spend a few hours with you? So I did, and learned a lot from her, what it means to be an image bearer, and even read her dissertation, which I still don't understand, but I understand enough. Is that what it means is God calls us, He has chosen us to be His image bearers, which means of our morality, individual, how we lead, but we're also to reflect the image of Christ and reveal the image of Christ to others. Much more important than just pointing people to Jesus. God has chosen to have us to speak through us, and not only what we say, but how we live. And if that's correct, that's what we are called to be. And that's where somebody asked about spiritual formation, that's a critical point to me, is what it means to be a bearer of God's image. And then the other thing is, too often we just talk about correct doctrine. We need to be people who also share with people eternal hope. Let me read, and then we're going to take a few minutes for question and answer. The last paragraph of this book, Emerging Hope, as I wrestled with this and finally this was my summary. Many Christians see the emerging culture as a hopeless cause, but I think that the opportunity for revival is greater today than it has been in the last 40 years. And I wrote this in the mid-90s. Still believe it though. In the recent past, people have looked to the stable family of the 50s, societal changes in the 60s, the me generation of the 70s, and the good life of the 1980s for hope. In the 1990s and now in the 21st century, people are struggling to survive the confusing changes that surround them. They feel hopeless. Are we ready to offer them God's hope? And I hope we are. Took longer than I thought. There were a couple of extra stories. One or two questions, and I want to pray for us.
All right. Woo. Hello. So in the realm of having outward and ministries that offer hope and transformation, just in thinking about the intersection of faith, work, and economics, and really decentralizing ministry and empowering the people of God to do the work of the ministry, one of the questions that I'm wrestling with is, how do we measure that? How do we not just count nickels and noses? And how do we actually measure and have metrics for what we're actually aiming for, so that we're actually measuring and valuing what we're actually saying is success?
Okay, great question. Not meaning to pick on you, but that's a very modern question in terms of metrics. I mean, that's what the church, the business world came up with that, and so the church then adopted it. Okay. And a lot of times, whether it's in a varsity, it's our board of directors who are our trustees, who are business people, Gordon-Conwell, the people we have on the board, your church, your elders, and other people on your board, is that they live in that world, or they did. And so they want the church to do the same thing. Now, I'm not saying metrics is not, I think that's fine to do that, but all I would say, it's not the only thing, is that I want to see lives changed. I might have 40 people who became Christians or made a decision for Christ, but I want to know is how their lives different 5 years from now. I would tell my staff, when I leave in a varsity, isn't going to be what the numbers are like. It's going to be to change lives and how the lives then have changed in other people's. So I would just hold an intention and to see that we're building values as well as building metrics. And some of it cannot be quantified as much as it can be qualified. So let's pray. I'm always one to want to finish on time, and I'll be glad to stay around to talk to any of you further. Father, it's times like this that sometimes I feel overwhelmed, or feel for people here who feel overwhelmed. But help us to go back to the three original questions. How is culture changing? How are you involved in that change? And how do you desire for us individually or corporately be involved in that cultural change? I pray that you will give us a sense as we look at your scriptures and look at church history of how you are continuing pursuing us, no matter what was going on. But at the same time, you were doing things in the culture that we didn't see at the time. But we look back and say, I see God's faithfulness. It's like Habakkuk, if he would be 100 years later or 50 years later looking back after the Babylonian captivity and the exiles came back to Jerusalem, would he begin to see the revival of that community that only could happen through your work and the hardship you brought. Help us to be open to seeing you at work and get us out of our comfort zones. And I pray for our churches that those are people my age or existing leaders be willing to see the great things you've done through them and in them, but it's also time to prepare a new generation to take over leadership. And I pray that people in my age, other existing leaders, that your Holy Spirit will help them see that. And I thank you for places like Gordon-Conwell who are raising up new leaders for the church, and pray that that will continue to happen. So as we leave here today, help us to leave with a sense of dependence upon you, all of you, and a hope, not a wish, but a hope, assured hope that you are at work and will continue to be at work. For it's your Son's name we pray. Amen.